On what started as a typical morning in 1930, a crew were standing on the bridge of their ship when suddenly a shuddering and shaking ran through the entire length of the vessel. And what had moments before been just a typical early morning suddenly had turned into a life or death situation. Their ship, the RMS Tahiti, was sinking, and they were several hundred miles from land or help. But before we get to that story, if you enjoy maritime stories, please like and subscribe so that I know you want to see more of it, and it also really helps me grow. Alright, let's get to the story of the sinking of the RMS Tahiti. A forgotten story of incredible bravery and an inspiring fight to save a doomed ship until the very last minute. The Tahiti was a Royal Mail steam cargo ship and passenger liner all in one. She was built by the Alexander Stephen and Son of Govan under the name Port Kingston for the Direct West Mail Company. She was launched in April 1904 and completed that August. She was 460 feet long, and she had a beam of 55 feet, a depth of 24, a draught of 27, and she weighed 7,585 gross registered tons. Within her, passengers could find plentiful accommodations, 277 berths for first class, 97 berths and cabins for second, and an additional 141 cabins for third class. These were spread across 4 decks, and the passengers were joined by her crew of 135. Her cargo holds were actually refrigerated, allowing for her to carry fruit and perishable goods on crossings. This ship actually had quite the history before her sinking, and we will be summarizing some of it now. In 1907, she was breached in the 1907 Kingston earthquake, which was a magnitude of 6.2 and has actually been called one of the deadliest quakes in recorded history. It caused almost $1 billion in damage if adjusted to reflect today's currency. The earthquake hit at about 3:30 p.m. local time, and the greatest damage of the event occurred at Kingston and at Buff Bay and a few other spots along Jamaica's northeast coast. A suspension bridge at Port Maria was destroyed in the quake, and the shaking itself lasted for only 35 seconds, but it was accompanied by a roaring sound, as if the army of hell itself was climbing out of the earth as it shook. The quake was followed by a total of 80 recorded aftershocks. The Tahiti herself, still under her original name at the time, was actually breached during the quake but refloated. This was lucky and likely saved her, as she'd been docked at the area during the time of the quake for repairs, and a nearby fire caused by the quake actually threatened her. But thankfully, she did not end up burning. A temporary repair that was very quickly done allowed her to be moved to a safer location, an unaffected nearby rail yard. In 1911, the ship was renamed to the Tahiti, and she began a new route to accompany her new name. Come the First World War, she was used as a troop transport ship. She was in the convoy that transported the first detachment of the Australian and New Zealand Imperial Expeditionary Forces to the front. Then, in 1918, while en route to England, she and the rest of her convoy reached Freetown, and there were reports of a disease outbreak on land that led to the ships being quarantined. But this didn't stop the 1918 influenza outbreak from finding its way on board her. On August 26th, the first soldiers to fall ill from the Spanish flu on the ship reported to her hospital, and by the time the ship arrived at Devonport on September 10th, 68 men had died, and another 9 died shortly afterwards as well. In 1930, the Tahiti was still in service and enjoyed the return to peacetime service. On August 12th of that year, while carrying 103 passengers on board her, along with 149 crew and 500 tons of cargo, she was en route to San Francisco after having left Sydney. She was at 20 degrees 43 minutes south, 166 degrees 16 minutes west, or 480 nautical miles southwest of the Cook Islands, when, at 4:30 a.m. on August 15th, 1930, a shudder suddenly ran through the ship. Her starboard propeller shaft had broken and torn a large opening into her stern. Water gushed with ferocity into the tear, and the ship began rapidly flooding. Her wireless operator sent an SOS, and her crew began firing distress rockets. The passengers were told there was a possibility they would have to abandon ship. Meanwhile, the crew fought valiantly to save the ship. The longer they could keep her afloat, the greater the chance they all had for survival. They knew this. Staying on the ship itself with a wireless set while it was afloat was a better alternative than floating in the open ocean in the little lifeboats. This fight to keep her afloat was crucial because the ship was so isolated that it took over 17 hours after the opening had been torn into the ship before the first help arrived. The steamship Pinabrin arrived on the scene at 10:10 p.m. She stood by the Tahiti throughout the night, her floodlights shining on the ship all the while. The rescue ship also had her boat swung out and made ready, her crew ready to go over to the stricken Tahiti and give assistance to her crew and passengers if needed. Finally, the passengers were told to leave the ship. People gathered some of their belongings from their cabins, and at 9:30 a.m. on August 17th, the Tahiti's lifeboats were lowered and all her passengers and some of her crew were taken off. Essential personnel were left on board the Tahiti because not all hope was lost for the ship yet. The flooding was still spreading and her crew were doing everything to stop or slow it. Meanwhile, another ship, the American steamship Ventura, arrived and signaled that she'd take the passengers and crew from the Tahiti. The passengers were picked up by the Ventura as they abandoned ship. Meanwhile, those of the Tahiti's crew still on board, joined by a boat of crew from the Pinabrin and more of the Tahiti's crew that returned to the ship, continued trying to stop the flooding, but it was becoming clear now that it couldn't be stopped. Efforts then began to save the passengers' luggage and mail from the Tahiti's cargo hold because now everyone knew that the loss could only be delayed. No matter what they would do, it would only be a matter of time. The Tahiti was doomed. Now, with that in mind, just think for a minute on the guts that it would take to go back inside of a sinking ship, not once but several times, to save the passengers' belongings and the mail from the holds. Going several times back inside when you know at any moment she could take a plunge and go down. Aside from the crew staying at their posts in the engine room to fight back the water for as long as they could, only leaving when it became clear the ship was going down and they couldn't put it off for much longer, that is serious bravery and inspiring courage. All around them, the floor would not only have been slanting towards the stern, but also the ship would have been creaking and groaning as water flooded her more and more. Sadly, despite the bravery of her engine room crew keeping to their posts and fighting against the rising water, slowing it as much as they could, she and her crew had lost the fight. By 1:35 p.m., the Tahiti began settling rapidly. Water was flooding the lower halls and lapping over the stern, and the crew finally abandoned ship. The ship's papers were saved, along with her bullion, and no one went back on board for anything else. Finally, at 4:42 p.m. on August 17th, the Tahiti sank 460 miles from the Cook Islands. Thanks to the valiant efforts of the crew of all three ships, the Tahiti sank without loss of life roughly 60 hours after the stern was damaged. The crew fought back the water and fought to save the ship for 60 hours after the death blow was dealt to her. The Tahiti's sinking was deemed to be due to a peril of the sea which no reasonable human care or foresight could have avoided, and the Court of Inquiry into the event concluded their session with, "We deem it our duty to place on record this appreciation for the conduct of the master and all those under him." And they were right. The fight by the crew to keep her afloat for as long as possible is very inspiring. They fought back the water for 60 hours. They kept the ship's lights running for 60 hours. The ship's wreck today rests somewhere on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, rusting, corroded, and undiscovered. A silent monument to the incredible efforts of the crew, the fight to save her, and of a good ship with lots of history, more than I told in this video. Perhaps one day it will be found, and we will get to see what kind of condition she is in today, as well as the damage that was the death blow. And maybe inside of her are still some clues as to the actions of the crew. Switches in the engine rooms flipped into certain positions to keep the lights and the pumps working to expel the water out. Getting to see those would really tell an incredible story. It would be fascinating to see where all of the switches and pumps are set on. Perhaps one day, this story will be adapted into a film. Getting to see the incredible fight to save the ship by her crew would be a very inspirational story to see on the big screen, fighting back the water until the ship finally went down. I know I'd go see it. I think it would be an incredible story for people to know. Unfortunately, This story has been all but forgotten today. Hopefully, though, this video and others that are on YouTube will introduce some new people to this story of bravery to the very end, even when the fight was clearly going to be lost. The crew never gave up until it was absolutely necessary for them to leave. And I hope one day someone will find her. Tell me if you'd watch a film based on this story. I know I would. And stay tuned as well, because tomorrow we'll be diving into another very obscure maritime mystery you've probably never heard before. So until then, thank you for watching.